We are just a shade over 24 hours away from the NHL trade deadline. Today, let's play matchmaker.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Thursday edition of Locked On NHL. I'm Nick Zararis, the host of Locked On Oilers. That's my good friend and my co-host, Hunter Hodies, the co-host of Locked On Penguins. And we want to thank everyone who's making Locked On NHL their first listen of the day. Locked On NHL, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, Hunter, my friend, we've got a lot of business to get to, 24 hours away. The subject matter of this episode very well could change in the course of while we're recording. I did want to talk about Brian Dumoulin as a potential addition for the Oilers. That's no longer in the cards. So our plan, as long as nothing crazy happens in the course of while we're recording, we're going to start with talking about the players that are available, what the seller's market means for the team shopping. We're going to pivot to what contenders need. And then in our final segment, we're going to try and match them together. We're going to try and match team to player. So starting with who's available. This is arguably the weakest trade deadline availability in that I can recall. Last year, we had a nice list of guys. There were some under the radar pieces who ended up getting moved, like Tomas Hertl as well. But this year, it feels like Brock Nelson is the best forward that's available. It seems like the best defenseman available very well might be Rasmus Ristolainen, which is a hilarious sentence. Goalie-wise, Karel Vejmelka got locked up. John Gibson left the Duck game last night hurt. Vanacek already got traded, so unless the Sharks are going to trade Georgiev as well, this is as weak as I can ever recall a deadline being.
Yeah, this is really weak, and you're seeing it right now, Nick, this is such a seller's market. I don't think I've seen a seller's market this crazy in a long time. Like, some of the prices that you've seen for some of these deals are absolutely ridiculous. I mean, the Brian Dumoulin trade, which just happened right before we started recording, he gets dealt for a second-round pick and a prospect. I like Brian Dumoulin. Penguin royalty really helped them win the Stanley Cup in 2016, same for 2017, but he's not even close to that same player. He's on the decline. Is he really worth a second and a prospect? No, but it's a seller's market right now. Like, Pat Verbeek did a really nice job with that return. The Devils, they're a little bit desperate. I'm not surprised that they're still buying a little bit because they're trying to make the playoffs, even though Jack Hughes is out for the season with that really severe shoulder injury, Nick. And I feel bad because he was having a really good year. And without Hughes, I'm not sure how deep they're going to go in the playoffs. But again, you look at that Tampa Bay trade from Wednesday as well. I like it for Seattle quite a bit. I mean, they got 2 firsts, a second, and a player for both Yanni Gordon and Oliver Borkstrand, but that's the price that Tampa Bay wanted to pay because they're all in it to win once again with this score. When you have Hall of Famers on your team, you owe it to them to try and go all in every year. But, some years we get buyer markets where the prices aren't that high, but sometimes you get a seller's market like this where these prices are outrageous, even though there's not a lot of, I would say, really great players available for trade. We have to see what happens with Mikko Rantanen. If I'm the Hurricanes, man, I would just keep him for the rest of the season. The East is absolutely wide open. Why would you move him and make your team worse when you're trying to go for a Stanley Cup? And again, in a conference that I don't really think is that deep this year. He's probably the best player that could be available, but still, is Carolina actually going to move him? Again, I would not. But those are just some of my miscellaneous thoughts on the deadline so far.
As far as, let's start there. We should probably start with Rantanen because technically he's available. You could you can briefly, we can talk about him, Elias Pettersson. I guess technically Rasmus Anderson as well, Mitch Marner as well, of names we've heard, but there's not a lot of movement on. And starting with Rantanen, let's start with the Marner, Anderson, and Pettersson. I don't think any of those guys are getting moved. There's a funny world where you end up seeing like a Marner for Rantanen straight swap, which I could see working relatively well for both sides just because they provide a little bit of something different for each team. But as far as Rantanen, I don't think if you're Carolina, it makes sense to trade him. I think you gave up Necas and Drury, 2 guys I'm really high on who have played really well since getting to Colorado, and you owe it to Rantanen a little bit more to try and figure out how he fits because he hasn't been there all of that long. And got off to a bit of a slow start, and you just want to make sure you investigate it. You want to turn over every rock before you give up. This is a consensus top, at worst, 20 player in the entire NHL. At worst.
Yeah. I just don't know why you would move him. The value that you get back is not going to help you for this season, because that's what this is about. You traded for him to help you this season. Yes, I know you also traded for him to potentially extend him for 8 years, because after the deadline, you'll be the only team that can extend him for 8 years until he tests free agency. And while I get that he doesn't want to sign an extension right now, who's to say that changes later on? Like, you can convince Rantanen to potentially re-sign if you go on to have a nice end of the regular season and a potential deep playoff run. You shouldn't just give up because he's saying like, oh, I don't want to commit around the trade deadline and all that stuff. You should keep at it. Like, with Gensel last year, they didn't really keep at it until like 2 days before free agency. I think they are learning a little bit from that. You should try to keep at it even during the end of the regular season, and then especially even when the playoffs start, you should keep at it with that as well. It makes no sense to trade him, especially in a conference where there's a few good teams at the top, and I would say Carolina is one of them, and then the rest of it is just kind of mid to below average. I would keep Rantanen. And then Marner, Toronto's not going to move him. Makes no sense. And then Elias Pettersson, Nick, no chance. Like, Vancouver's also in a playoff race. I think that's more of a summer move. And then with Marner, again, the Leafs will figure that out after their season ends, like if they're going to extend him or if he's going to test the market.
So we've mentioned those guys. We mentioned Brock Nelson. Brock Besser, also a pending unrestricted free agent. Other names that have drawn consideration: Scott Lawton, Ricard Raquel, Brandon Tanev, Riley Smith, and then that's another one. Braden Shen, Dylan Cousins, maybe Kyle Palmieri. This is not the year to go out and get a big fish. But if you think you're close and you only need like one guy in your top 9, this might be the deadline for you. And we've really seen that over the years, that the targeted deadline additions are the ones that make big impacts. You think about Ivan Barbashev and Jonathan Quick for the Golden Knights a couple of years ago. Last year for Florida, going out and getting Vladimir Tarasenko. Not the biggest name, not Jake Gensel, not Noah Hannafin, but they went out and got a targeted guy. Tampa Bay still gets glazed for going out and getting Blake Coleman and Barclay Goodrow ahead of that deadline, and they won 2 Stanley Cups with those guys. And you can keep doing this on and on. Colorado, the year they won the cup, they went out and got Josh Manson and Arturi Lehkonen. So if you needed that specialized guy, one more top 9 winger or a second pair, third pair defenseman that kills penalties, which is what we've seen be successful, this is the year for you.
Right. I mean, you saw Tampa Bay do that on Wednesday. Julian Brisebois, I kind of compare him to the Rams GM when the Rams won the Super Bowl, Nick. Remember, he traded away almost his entire draft around the trade deadline to make his team better. Basically said, literally, F them picks. They went on to win the Super Bowl that year of the Cincinnati Bengals. That is what Julian Brisebois is doing right now. He does not care about those draft picks. He sees having a prime Kucherov, a prime Braden Point, Jake Gensel. He sees Andrei Vasilevsky having a 924 caliber season compared to last year. He was 900. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to go all in. I see the conference isn't that good. I'm going to go get Yanni Gourde back, who can really help my third line. And I'm going to go get Bjorkstrand, who can play on my second line. Picks be damned. And I would not be surprised if you see at least a couple other teams decide to do a move like that either today or Friday that feel like they're close. I could see the Kings potentially doing something like that, because I think Rob Blake is feeling the pressure in LA, knowing that if the Kings don't go that far in the playoffs this year, he could be without a job. So if you feel like you are close and you see a good player that is available despite the high price, I think you might have to owe it to your group and be like, you know what? I know I'm paying a high ticket here, but at the end of the day, banners hang forever, and I'm willing to take that risk.
And that's the mindset you got to have if you're close. And we'll end the segment on that note. You owe it to yourself if you are close, especially if you're in the Eastern Conference this year. Because you look at it, going into this week, I felt Florida, even with Matthew Tkachuk injured, was still my favorite to win the East. I know Carolina's having a nice season. I know Toronto is always relatively solid in the regular season. But Florida has proven to me they can win in those big games. They have the style of play and the players who really fit what playoff hockey is. And then Tampa Bay went out and added 2 top 9 forwards to a team that has 4 future Hall of Famers, still has Cirelli, still has Ryan McDonough, and has acclimated Jake Gensel extremely well. So now I feel like Florida and Tampa Bay are firmly at the top of the East. And if you're Carolina, if you're the Devils, if you're Toronto, you got to go out there and make something happen if you want to make this your year, because those teams got better this week. And Florida is going to probably make another move other than Seth Jones, who we haven't mentioned yet, but that happened a few weeks ago. We're going to take our first break on today's show. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the contenders that are out there, what they need, and then we're going to try and match it all up. See you guys in a sec. When the game tips off, NBA action is just getting started. And there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip or want to bet on a big fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. Or if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Anytime my friends and I are watching a game together tomorrow when we're at Devils Jets, I will absolutely be convincing and organizing a squad ride on something. What? I'm not sure yet, but almost certainly going to bet on a Kyle Connor goal. Or maybe we do something crazy like Connor Hellebuck over 30 saves. You never feel like you missed a chance with the live betting feature. Plus, the app is easy to use. And when you win, FanDuel pays out instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out here with Hunter and I on this Thursday edition of Locked On NHL. And Hunter, my friend, when we talk about the contenders, I feel like in the West, it's Vegas, Winnipeg, Colorado, and then everyone else. I think the last month, I would say the last 2 weeks for Edmonton have really soured me on their big picture prospects. Minnesota, we know, is looking at adding. Dallas, we know, is looking at adding. Colorado almost certainly still probably needs to add one more piece. I know they went out and got Ryan Lindgren and Jimmy Vesey, but those are not significant additions. They're not really moving the needle. They're warm body type guys. I suppose the Kings could stand to add as well. Or if you're a team on the bubble like the Canucks or Utah, maybe you go out there and you try and add one or two more things. Maybe look at someone with some term to try and have on the team for the next 2 seasons. But it feels like out West, we're going to see kind of what we saw going down to the wire last year, where on the last day, Vegas added Tomas Hertl and Noah Hannafin in the span of a week.
Yeah, I think you're going to see a little bit of an arms race here, in the final 24 hours in the West especially. I still think the Oilers have something else up their sleeve.
They have to.
I know it's tough, but you can't trust that goaltending going into the playoffs. I think they got to do something there. They may not, Nick, but I know as the host of Locked On Oilers, that they can't go in with these two goalies.
It's even bad. Even if you're the Oilers and you say, we want to be loyal to Stu, we trust Stu, you need to upgrade your backup spot.
Yeah.
Calvin Pickard is having the best 2 seasons of his life the last 2 years. He's like an .898 goalie, and he's won a lot of games behind a really good team. You need to upgrade that spot, because if Calvin Pickard needs to start more than 2 games in a row, you're cooked. It just no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If you need to play Calvin Pickard more than 2 games in a row, you just don't have a high enough end range of outcomes. I've suggested Jonathan Quick as the most logical, but he's not going to want to leave the East Coast. That's the thing. He's spent his entire life on the West Coast as a guy from the Northeast. He's finally living in Connecticut. On Monday, one of my friends texted me that she was working his kid's youth hockey game on Monday morning, and he was at the game. He can't really do that if he gets traded to the Oilers. So I don't think that's in the cards. The only other crazy one, and this wouldn't work because the Oilers probably don't have the money. You need to get one of the Buffalo goalies, whether that's Pekka Luukkonen or Devin Levy. You need to trade for a goalie who doesn't have a path to starting. I suppose it could be Daniel Vladar, but a Flames-Oilers trade is probably unlikely to pull off for a variety of reasons. But you can't keep doing this with Pickard and Skinner, man. They were dreadful against the Ducks on Tuesday.
Agreed. And I was looking at John Gibson as well, but then obviously he got a little bit banged up last night. He's having one of the best seasons of his career this year, Nick. He's been fantastic on one of the worst teams in the league. It felt like for a while Gibson's game was really going down just because playing on some bad Ducks teams. He's just being kind of left out to lunch every night, kind of just with the way the Ducks play defensively in front of him. But he's been playing really well this year. I think he's going to get moved eventually, but still may not be around this deadline. But he's still someone that I at least had circled a little bit. For Winnipeg, I still think they need a forward. I think if you can get someone that can play in your top 9 or in your top 6, that makes a lot of sense. There's a couple players that we will do for matchmaker in the final segment that I have in mind for Winnipeg that makes sense for their forward group. Vancouver, they added Marcus Pettersson, they added Drew O'Connor. Jim Rutherford and Patrick Allvin love to wheel and deal around this time of year. I'm fascinated to see how aggressive they get because they're in the playoff race. They're going to get, if they get in, one of the 2 wild card spots. I think they might go for some depth adds. I don't think they're going to do anything, seismic, but I still think they're going to add. Minnesota, you got to reward the group. I mean, they're better than I think any of us thought they were going to be this year. You need to add to them in some capacity, probably up front with the injuries that they have. And same with Colorado. I love Colorado's top line. I think their second line is also fine. Their bottom 6 needs work. I think if you can get an impact forward for their third line, I think that makes a lot of sense defensively. Maybe a depth defenseman that can also help out your second and third pairing. That makes sense to me as well. Sakic and McFarland are going to be pretty active for the next 24 hours with how their front office is. And then, Vegas, they're always up to something, Nick. Like, Vegas, they are poised to strike. That front office, one of the best front offices in the league. They have an owner who loves being aggressive. They will do something by Friday afternoon. There's no doubt in my mind.
They've been very quiet. They haven't even been really linked to anyone, which is kind of when that they're striking. I jokingly said that's who Rantanen's going to end up getting traded to if Carolina doesn't want him. I was making the joke earlier in the year that Marner, it made sense as a landing spot there. I think if you're Vegas, you probably need to bolster your forward group. You could stand to add a defenseman. This is a very open-ended wish list because, frankly, you can always use more depth. We know, Hunter, that in the playoffs, you're going to go through at least 8 or 9 defensemen because of injuries. You're going to go through 13, 14, maybe even as many as 15 forwards over the course of a playoff run if you get to a Stanley Cup final. So having depth and quality depth is utterly essential. Jimmy Vesey is fine for Colorado, but you're going to need him at some point in that playoff run. And it's why if you're the LA Kings, even if you feel good about your top 6, you need another forward. You can always add another defenseman. And in a market like this, it's a good year to sell is the way I would describe it. And because of that, we're going to see who's got an appetite for risk because this is as risky as it's going to get because you're talking yourself into, well, if Brian Dumoulin got a second-round pick, Brock Nelson's getting a first-round pick. And if he's getting a first-round pick, what would Mikko Rantanen get? And really quickly, you start to escalate. Brian
Dumoulin gets a second. I want to know what the Penguins can get for Matt Grzelcyk. Seriously, I'm not trying to be a troll about that. I just want to know what they can get for him as a power play 2 quarterback specialist.
Yeah, he's having a nice counting stat season, Matt Grzelcyk. I think if the Oilers hadn't gone out and gotten John Klingberg, Matt Grzelcyk was a guy I was looking at. I still think the Oilers are going to add a defenseman. I just have no idea who. Having Klingberg in the mix does make it a bit more complicated because they already have 7 defensemen on the roster, and I don't think anyone is waivers eligible to go to the AHL without having to clear first. So that becomes a conundrum if you want to waive whether it's Troy Stetcher or John Klingberg to try and clear them to go and get them. But all I'll say before we wrap this second segment, make sure you're keeping an eye. The waivers deadline is 2:00. You'll get an idea of who's going to start making moves. Same thing with guys coming off of LTIR. We haven't mentioned Chris Kreider once as somebody who could be moved, but that's because he's on injured reserve at the moment. Hunter and I are going to take one more quick break. When we come back, we're going to try and match some of these players up to landing spots. Be right back. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out with Hunter and I on this Thursday edition of Locked On NHL, the day before the NHL trade deadline for the 2024-2025 season. Okay, my friend, who do you want to start with? Do you want to start with teams or do you want to start with a player? Because I have a specific one in mind.
I have a specific one in mind as well for a player, and I've kind of thrown this out a little bit. I think Brock Nelson to the Winnipeg Jets makes
that was the one I had in my mind.
Oh, well,
yeah.
Great minds think alike. I wasn't sure if you had that, but I think that move makes so much sense. Another scorer for their lineup. He can play anywhere, whether it's the first line, second line. Heck, they can put him on their third line. They're that deep.
He can play power play. He can penalty kill.
And the Jets, they owe it to the players to go all in. Yeah. We said it last week, Nick. This is the best Jets team since
the return to Winnipeg. Yeah.
Yes. I think this is the best team since then. You have a goalie who is playing outside his mind this year. You have Kyle Connor and Nikolai Ehlers who have been outstanding. Morrissey has been great. Scheifele has been awesome. You owe it to these long-term players to go all in a conference that, yes, is deep, but I think the Jets are the best team in the conference right now with Vegas. With Vegas, I think. Edmonton is up there as well. I still think when they're humming, I think they can beat these teams in a 7-game series. It's still going to be tough, though, because of the way the Oilers are playing. But I think Brock Nelson to the Jets makes so much sense. I think Palmieri also makes sense for them as well, someone that can also play on their third line. Kevin Cheveldayoff's been quiet, but I think he's going to strike here in the next 24 hours. That's just me, though.
Speaking of Kyle Palmieri, I like him for the Devils to add to their bottom six because the Devils' bottom six.
Okay.
The Devils' bottom six has been really stinky this year. Like, they just haven't scored enough, created enough offense. And Palmieri, he's got 40 points on the year. He's expiring at the end of this season. I think any team would be really smart to add him. Before the Oilers went and got Trent Frederick, I really wanted Kyle Palmieri for the Oilers, and they just need more depth scoring. And Palmieri's not flashy, but he's been in a lot of playoff games. He's got a ton of experience. He's got pretty decent hands even still at this point. The other big one I had in mind, and the other landing spot that makes sense for Brock Nelson is Minnesota. I could definitely see that as the alternative if it's not Winnipeg. I think Minnesota really needs another top 6 center. I think if you can have him and Eric Sinek down the middle, that's a lot better than what you presently have. It can push Rossi a little further down the lineup. And Marco Rossi's having a solid season, but I think you would rather have somebody with a little bit more experience in that role. The other big one I had in mind, I really like the idea of a team like the Flames going out and getting Dylan Cousins. I really like the idea of the Flames going out, and the Flames have a bazillion assets over the next 2 years because they tore it all the way down last year. Dylan Cousins is under contract for 5 more years. He's in his early 20s. And you owe it to that group to say, we appreciate the work you've put in this year. You owe it to Dustin Wolf, who's playing his butt off every single night. And he fits. He's young enough where he can build along and grow along with the group that you're trying to acclimate. So I don't think the Flames are going to go out and take a big swing, but I really like the idea of them going out and getting a guy with term who fits their window, who's young, who has upside, and can be a 30-goal guy.
At the very least, you should reward the players for the season that they're having. Like, no one expected the Flames to be this much in the race in early March. I mean, when we did our season predictions, we said last week, we had them towards the bottom of the Pacific Division. Like, we did not think they were going to be that good this year. Credit to Dustin Wolf, credit to the players, credit to the coaching staff. They have proved a lot of people wrong, and they have a legit shot at squeaking into the playoffs this year. So I think if you are Craig Conroy, you should go out there and at least make, even if it's a small move, you should reward the players for the season that they're having. One more player I have for you, Rickard Rakell. I see the Kings, man. I think that makes a lot of sense. They've been struggling to score this year. You put him in your top 6. Rakell has 29 goals here. He's 5 away from from tying his career high, of 34 that he had with the Ducks. He's 6 away from breaking or having a new career high, That move makes a lot of sense. And I know that Rob Blake, once again, is under a bit of pressure. I also could see Vegas in on Rakell. That seems like a very Vegas move. They're already so deep. Adding Rickard Rakell, basically a 30-goal scorer for a bad Penguins team, that makes all the sense in the world to me. I've been trying to figure out potentially someone for J.J. Peterka, Nick, because I think the Sabres will have to be careful about that. Peterka, only 23 years old. He's had a really nice start to his career. I wonder, again, if a team,
Flyers.
What'd you say?
Flyers.
The Flyers, that would be interesting.
Because that's the way I look at those types of moves.
I still look at maybe Colorado for someone like Peterka. I think he would thrive there
I don't know if Colorado has the assets.
That's
The
true.
thing. Because if you're trading a guy like that, you probably want something decent in return. It's the same problem with a Dylan Cousins trade. Like, there are 31 teams in the NHL that could use a Dylan Cousins on their team to be a second or third line center. It's just a matter of not everybody has the assets to go out and get a big player like that. Somebody I was thinking about and trying to come up with an idea for a landing spot was Brock Besser. And my first thought was Florida before they went out and got Seth Jones, because it feels like if you drop Brock Besser in their middle six, that's an easy 10 goals in 20 games type deal. I don't know. Because I feel like Vancouver is going to want to do a player for player type deal because they're going to want to stay in the race. But at the same time, I feel like it would be irresponsible if you're Patrick Alvin to just let him walk to free agency this summer because you're not extending him. You just know you're not.
No, I don't think they are. I don't really think it makes much sense to give him all that term and that money with where the Canucks are. I think Besser kind of owes it to himself, whether he stays with the Canucks for the rest of the season or not, to go to free agency. Like, if he gets traded, obviously a different story. He can potentially sign an extension there. But I with how far apart they are on contract talks, I don't see it happening. I don't.
Okay, one other one I was curious about. Number one, why does everybody like Scott Lawton so much?
Why are teams thinking of giving a first round pick away? Like, Scott Lawton is a fine player, man. He's a fine player. He's not worth a first round pick. I know this draft is very weak, but like at that price that I keep seeing for him is ridiculous.
I think that's out there to try and drive the price down because I that's crazy to me.
Yeah.
Scott Lawton's I don't think he's ever had 30 goals in a season. I don't think he's ever broke 50 points in a season, if I remember correctly. He's a solid third line center, plays penalty kill, can occasionally chip a little bit in offensively. His career high in goals is 18, and that was 2 years ago when he was playing 18 minutes a game. I just don't see a world where that's worth a first round pick, even if you're a good team. I forget who it was. It might have been Dimitri, it might have been Jay Fresh, who said something along the lines of Scott Lawton and Rasmus Ristolainen to the Leafs feels very Leafs, and I can kind of see that because the Leafs want another defenseman and they need more depth. The Leafs third line has been an abyss all season. The Max Domi fit that worked out relatively well for them last year hasn't carried over year to year. Tavares and Austin Matthews aren't really producing at the same clip they have in years past this year as well. I don't know, man. This is a very stinky deadline. None of these moves are all of that exciting. Like Brock Nelson to Minnesota, Dallas, or Winnipeg, sure, that's pretty exciting. Maybe Dylan Cousins, maybe Chris Kreider, but you're taking a hell of a risk on Kreider because he's been injured all year and he's having the worst year of his career since he was like 20. Like, nothing is that exciting here.
Again, like, it's also been so quiet this week, I feel like normally the deadline day is the most quiet. Like, a lot of these teams like to get the business done during the week, like, say, Nick, 2 to 3 to 4 days in advance. But Monday, pretty quiet. Tuesday, a little quiet. Wednesday, okay, a little bit of action. Today, you had the Brian Dumoulin trade, but we're about 1 o'clock Eastern time finishing this show. Not really many moves have happened this week. I think a lot of buyers, at least right now, are kind of a bit scared about these prices. And I understand, like, these prices are crazy. It's a massive seller's market. But this has been, as a week, a little bit of a dud. I'm hoping that this is setting up to be a really fun deadline day on Friday, though, where teams are like, you know what? Screw it. We'll pay these prices. We were waiting forever to see if they'll go down. But you know what? Screw it. We're just going to buy.
And that's really the game, it turns into a waiting game of how patient can you afford to be, especially once guys start coming off the board. Who's going to sit on their hands and who's going to make something happen? And the one team we haven't talked about like at all that I do want to mention, don't sleep on Chris Drury doing something stupid tomorrow. Okay. Don't sleep on Chris Drury thinking that because they've won a couple games in a row and they're close to a playoff spot, don't sleep on him going out and getting another 33-year-old center to add to a group that's having a nice few weeks here. Like the win against Nashville and the Islanders were pretty good. They played reasonably well against Washington last night, but don't sleep on the Rangers doing something silly. But that'll do it for this edition of Locked On NHL. Everybody, enjoy deadline day. Subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts or over on YouTube. Hunter and I will talk to you guys next week, and hopefully we'll be talking about the new landscape across the NHL. See you guys then.